Hi, everybody, and welcome to the third week of the economics of cryptocurrency. So, just a really quick recap. In our first week, we, of course, introduced the organization of the course, and we went over supply and demand as review for really any good or service. But then at the end of those slides, you may recall that I went over demand and supply sort of characteristics for Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies specifically. Now, last week in week two, we looked at the characteristics of money. And then you in your collab assignment, which I haven't had a chance to look at yet, but hopefully discovered some characteristics of cryptocurrency as a money through what I showed you, and then maybe compared that to another potential money, or at least something that might be used as a store of value, unit of account, or something that could be used as a means of transactions. So a medium of exchange. So then one thing that's important to tie those things together is part of the demand for cryptocurrencies comes from its use in those different areas. If people expect Bitcoin to be very useful as a medium of exchange in the future, then they will want to hold more Bitcoin. The demand for Bitcoin will be higher. If people believe that it will be a great store of value, like maybe people are worried about inflation and they believe that holding Bitcoin would be a good way to store value, that would cause a shift in demand for Bitcoin. And as you know, an outward shift, and that would increase the price of Bitcoin. So I just wanted to tie those things two together first. Now, this week, we're going to be thinking about digital money broadly. The reason we're going to be thinking about digital money is A, it's really big. More than 90% of money is digital money nowadays. Um, and B, because really digital money is the system that cryptocurrencies and specifically what started with the Bitcoin white paper are responding to. They are responding to a system of digital money. They are digital monies themselves, but as we've already seen a little bit, they bring back some of the characteristics of cash that we like. So I'm going to start this just by showing you a really brief couple slides explaining that, but I just wanted to tie those three things together to start things off. So let's look at physical, really, this should probably be called cash, which is physical money, but this is just a really brief set of slides to get you a place where you can see these different lists. Uh, Continue to share. So, first of all, I just want to think about cash in the economy. So, right now, as of today, cash represents less than 10% of money globally and within the United States. What that means really is that digital money represents more than 90% of money. So that's why it's really important to understand digital money. Interestingly, I had a conversation with my daughter between the last video and this video. She counted up her savings and she has accumulated a pretty big pile of cash through chores. She has about $300. So I said, wow, now you have enough cash. You might want to go give it to a bank and then you could earn some interest. And we basically had this conversation. She's like, well, where will my money be? And I'm like, well, it will become digital money essentially. And so she would have been changing her money. She's in the 10% with her pile of cash, and she would have shifted to the 90% by depositing that into a bank. And that's a good sort of micro model for you to think about how this transition occurred. The transition from cash to digital money really started with a transition from cash to direct deposit banking, where people would start giving their monies to banks. And then bank transfers started to be more popular for large transactions and things like that because the banks gained trust. They lost trust, of course, at certain times too. But in the long run, people banks people trusted banks more and trusted this digital money world. It was really later that was all on paper, and then later the paper is what transitioned to digital with technology and with things like credit cards and debit cards, and that's what really hastened the transition to where we are today, where the vast majority of monies are digital. So cryptocurrency, and this is important because I think this is a really another really simple model that you can think about is what really are cryptocurrencies? Well, cryptocurrency can be seen as an attempt at getting back some of the characteristics of cash in a digital money world. So what are those characteristics of cash? Well, one is anonymity that we've mentioned. So cash is not tied to identity in any way. Irreversibility. Once I give somebody cash and they leave and I don't see them anymore, it's not easy to reverse that transaction. Versus if I go into a store, buy something, decide I don't like it, go back to Walmart, for example. Walmart is kind of like a big trusted intermediary in that transaction. I probably have enough trust for Walmart. I believe Walmart's incentives are to keep their customers happy over a long period of time. So I'm going to have more trust there in terms of things like reversibility. Now, there might be trust limitations in some transactions. That's difficult to deal with digital money, but maybe if we have cash, then, and we'll talk about specific examples of that in a second. My dog is making some weird noises again. I think that's happened in previous videos. There's also very low infrastructure needs for cash. If everybody's holding enough cash to make transactions, then we don't need things like computer databases to store digital records. So when is cash still used? And it aligns with those characteristics. So peer-to-peer low trust transactions without an intermediary. So think about these two. I might look at the KSL website, which is like Craigslist if you haven't seen it. I'm assuming most of you have seen it, but it's places where they have like classifieds. Like I could find somebody to mow my lawn, or I might be able to find a used car or other used items on KSL pretty easily. Those are going to be low trust transactions because I don't know the other person. I don't really have a way to reverse transactions that I made with those people. So cash is going to be very common in those situations. New technologies, things like Venmo or PayPal are pretty common those types of transactions. Now think about that versus an Uber ride, because an Uber ride is also peer to peer, but it's useful to think about what Uber really is. Uber is kind of like a trusted intermediary. All of us are like, well, I wouldn't necessarily trust this person to give me a ride to where I want to go. They wouldn't necessarily trust me to not just jump out of the car at the end of the ride and not pay them. So what creates trust in that relationship? This other large company that has depends on reputation because they compete with other companies like Lyft. They have some strong incentives to try to create trust between drivers and riders in the Uber environment. And so those types of little models, I mean, we see these everywhere where there's motivation to create trust, and that's based really in monetary transactions between individuals. We can also see emergency situations could impact the infrastructure of digital money in ways where cash became king. You might want to have some cash sitting around if there's an emergency situation or we lose access to the internet or lose access to electricity, for example. Now, another example is a lack of banking services that we mentioned when I showed the map. Vietnam has very few a lot of people don't have access to traditional banking services, so they might use cash instead. They might not have a bank that they can trust to keep their money safe through a deposit. Um, and then, of course, black market transactions, because black market transactions, there may be an illegal transaction where people want anonymity out of that transaction. So these are just broadly the reasons why we still have some cash use and why, again, there might be demand because we can imagine some of these things being easier digitally, like the Venmo example with lawn mowing. But of course, that's not going to work for a black market transaction because you can't just be buying kilos off of Venmo or something like that because other regulators would take note of that. So those transactions are still going to be in cash or cryptocurrencies that have bring back the anonymity component. Reversibility would matter potentially a lot in some types of black market transactions too. And now this isn't to say like, oh, we need this because we need black market transactions. No, this is to say this is where part of the demand for these types of transactions comes from. It's just a reality of the way things work. Now, based on that, I found a couple articles that I wanted to show you guys. So I thought this was a great follow-up. We talked about Venezuela a little bit already last time. So here, Maduro is, of course, the former leader of Venezuela that the United States went and got recently. And this article in the Wall Street Journal, Maduro's crypto-backed oil deals put Tether at the center of Venezuela money drama. The stablecoin served as a tool to avoid sanctions. We already talked about that as one because remember, Venezuela was exporting oil, selling it to places like China. It was sanctioned. So the United States and some other countries decided, no, you're not allowed to sell oil because you've done things we don't like. We don't want you to sell oil. Well, to secretly sell oil, the Venezuela government was using Tether, which is another cryptocurrency we talked about last time. Tether is different than Bitcoin in that its goal is to trade one for one with a dollar. One Tether is worth $1. That's kind of like why you would expect them to like that currency because they prefer to get paid in US dollars. They can't do that easily with cash because of transaction costs. Moving that amount of cash around is very costly. They can't do it as easily with the traditional digital banking because regulators would take note of that. So cryptocurrencies would step in to allow them to make anonymous transactions in lieu of sanctions or in the context of sanctions. Now, I really like this little headline because it's like, and a lifeline for everyday citizens. So we're getting back. So lack of banking services trusted banks. Citizens did not trust banks or trust monetary regulators in Venezuela. For example, if I just hold my money in Venezuelan pesos, I want to say. I don't know if that's exactly right, but there's horrible inflation. So it's a horrible store of value. I do not want to be storing value in Venezuelan dollars. I also can't really, there's not really trusted banks in Venezuela. So the citizens are motivated by this, while the government, Maduro and his cronies, were motivated by black market transactions. And so I thought that was really interesting that that article really gets on both sides of the coin. Another article that I will whet your palate with. There's a fight in the United States right now. Banks cry foul over high-yielding tokens as crypto fight simmers in Washington. Now, this is a very domestic issue in the United States, but I think importantly also maybe will be an issue in Utah because Utah has a lot of relatively small regional banks. Zion's Bank, Golden West Credit Union. I was just went to an event with the CEO of Golden West Credit Union. He was talking about savings rates paid to members because if you save your money at a credit union, you're called a member because those are owned by the people who deposit their money in credit unions. That's the difference between a credit union and a bank. Now, banks are getting worried because I maybe can save my money in a cryptocurrency like Tether, and maybe Tether will offer me rewards. And maybe they're trying to use definitions that are a little bit different than the definition of just interest because maybe that allows them to get around certain regulations. And so basically, we have banks are fighting with cryptocurrency firms right now in Washington over at the Senate Banking Committee to advance a bill defining crypto market rules. So they're trying to find some of these rules. Banks are saying, hey, if you let these cryptos pay these large rewards, which are basically that's what interest is, then that's going to become a competitive issue for banks. And now this is where now we're getting into economics because economists tend to like competition, right? What happens when banks have to compete against each other? They have to offer consumers higher rates of interest, for example. And so cryptocurrencies represent a competitive threat to banks. And I think that's an important thing to recognize when we read articles about what's happening in regulation. What are banks pushing for? What are different cryptocurrencies pushing for? That regulatory fight has to do with market power and competition. So I thought those were interesting. And if you guys are interested, I can send you PDFs of those articles if you'd like to read the whole things. In terms of like quizzes and tests, I might throw in a couple questions, very easy to quizzes related to articles I mentioned like that. Not that would require you to read the entire article. Um, On the tests, however, I might ask you more complicated questions about putting those things together at least. So I won't ask you something specific deep in that article that I didn't mention, but there is a good chance that I'll ask you questions that imply I expect you to be able to put these ideas together. Like Article 1, we saw explicitly two different motivations inside Venezuela, getting black market transactions and citizens who didn't have access to banking services. Then in this other one, we talked about competition between banks and cryptocurrencies because both of them, prior motivation, are involved in this big digital money world. So, coming back to the idea of digital money, once we have digital money and it's not just cash being handed around, how digital money works is it's just updates and spreadsheets. It's as simple as that, which you'll read about in the book this week. Literally, it's like, okay, Gavin wants to send $20 to Maria in a spreadsheet somewhere. I'm going to take $20 out of Gavin's column and put it in Maria's column. It's not quite as simple of that, but that's a reasonable enough model to use to think about the differences between physical and digital money. Nothing actually exists other than changes in spreadsheets in our digital money world. What does that mean? Well, we better trust the people that are in control of the spreadsheets, so we have trusted bookkeepers. Banks are an example of our trusted bookkeepers. Now, we know that banks have gotten in trouble before, so on top of those trusted bookkeepers, we have a lot of regulation around banks. Um, so one thing that comes up a lot is a double spending problem. How do I know that Gavin didn't take the same money and give it to 50 different people? Well, we depend on the bookkeepers, those trusted bookkeepers, to keep on top of that for us and be managing that system in the background for us. Now, there's all types of political and economic issues that come to play a role in that environment because maybe politicians have certain incentives and want regulators and those trusted bookkeepers to behave in certain ways. Because in fact, we kind of have double spending as a rule that banks are allowed to engage in through the reserve banking system. Hey, if Gavin deposits $100, you really only have to keep $10 of it and you can send $90 out and give it loans to other people. That, in a sense, is double spending. That's not necessarily bad, but we know that that can, if well managed, it can lead to economic growth. If not well managed, it can lead to big boom and bust cycles. So those all relate to the digital money system. The digital money system relates to how monetary policy is embedded in our economy is different now than it was pre-digital money. So really a lot of what this chapter is about is showing you in your book, because you're going to be reading part two of the book this week, which of course is explained in the different materials for this week's module. But really, a big part of that chapter is going into different types of transactions we might to observe. So I'm going to give $10 to Maria. Maybe Maria and I both have the same bank. That will be a relatively easy transaction from the bookkeeper's perspective. I'm one bank, Gavin has an account here, Maria has an account here. Take $10 out of Gavin's, add $10 to Maria's. Okay, now what if we're at two different banks within the US? If they're both large, it will be very easy. If one of them's very small, things might get a little bit more complicated, but we have a robust enough banking system that they wouldn't get too complicated. Now, what if we're in two different countries? And it goes into the details of that. I won't go crazy into the details here because you'll also work on that in your collab assignment this week. But broadly speaking, the different types of those transactions we could have is same bank, as I mentioned, different banks, same country, interbank payments. So that's going to be a different type of that can happen within country or across countries, cross border. And basically, what happens is each as it gets more complicated, we have more intermediaries, other parties in the transaction that aren't really engaged in the transaction, but we need to trust to help us make the transaction work. And I think in a very important thing that happens that you should think about as a citizen and an economist from this class is the role of correspondent banks. So oftentimes small banks hold accounts at larger banks. That larger bank is called their correspondent bank. That allows small banks to engage in this global digital money system more easily. However, the large bank might experience costs and risk when it has more of those correspondent banking relationships. So a large bank might say, you know what, my life is easier by not having these correspondent banking relationships. That leads to centralization in the digital banking system, like bigger and bigger banks, less smaller banks. That means we have less competition in the banking system. And as economists, you know the issues with less competition. Monopoly power is the main issue with less competition. That could decrease things like the quality of banking services. It could increase the price of banking services. It could decrease the interest rate that large banks are willing to pay for savings accounts. You might wonder, like, whoa, interest rates are high. Why does Chase Bank, the world's largest bank, pay such a low interest rate on savings accounts? That might be an expression of market power. Look, you need me because I'm the biggest bank. You can't really avoid transacting with me. So I can kind of take advantage of that by keeping some of that interest for myself or charging you more for different services that I offer if I'm the only one offering those services. And because of correspondent banking, I might even be able to play a role in what banks exist that can offer those services. So I want you to just pay attention and think about that when you hit that part of the book. Another thing you'll be doing this week is checking out a couple parts of the Bitcoin white paper, which I will show on my screen just to show you what I want you to check out. And you'll immediately see here. So here's the introduction. Um, Commerce on the internet has come to rely almost exclusively on financial institutions, banks, trusted bookkeepers, intermediaries, serving as trusted third parties to process electronic payments. So that's really like you are going to get into the weeds reading through the book and on your collab assignment and what that means. So while the system works well enough for most transactions, it still suffers from the inherent weakness of the trust-based model because, of course, all of these things we're talking about require trust. That's a key issue for the motivation of cryptocurrencies and what's required in this digital money world that we live in. So tie this introduction to the lessons, and then you're going to skip forward, I think it's section 9 or 10, to just this short privacy section. So traditional privacy, we have identities, we have transactions. So like I want to send $10 to Maria, we have the same bank. So I go to my trusted intermediary, that bank that we both bank at. And then the counterparty in my transaction is Maria in that example. So we always have to go through this trusted intermediary. The idea of Bitcoin is that identities are separated from transactions. That's where the anonymity comes in. So transactions are not private, but identities are private since they're not connected to transactions directly. And then those transactions are actually public, and that's what creates trust, the fact that they're public. I don't expect you to understand exactly why the fact that they're public creates trust yet, but that's where we're going pretty soon. So finally, I'm going to show you my version of the collab notebook. So again, just getting used to these. I hope it wasn't too hard. I heard from some of you. I helped some of you. Don't hesitate if you need help with these collab things at all. I hope it didn't seem too hard. I have these libraries already loaded. You can hide those if you want. Make sure to run that first. Always run from top to bottom. You can also click run all, which will cause it to run from top to bottom. So you'll see in the instructions, one of the first instructions is to run all cells to make everything works before you make any changes. Because if you start making changes and then things don't work, it'll get complicated to figure out why they're not working. So let's see here. So we're just gonna set up a toy. All I want you to do, it's kind of boring, which I apologize for, but maybe it'll get you a little bit used to the coding more, and just really get in your head how this digital money system is working. So I just want to show you to double click in here. Remember, this is how you can write in here. You could change my writing. You could write over my writing to answer your questions. Really, I'm looking for try like answer the questions in a place where it makes sense. Like if you made your graph and then you're answering a question about how volatile the thing works, try to put your written answers in places that make sense. You can add text in between any blocks of cells, above other text, stuff like that. You can double click and write over my text. I'm fine with all of that. Just try to keep it broadly organized so it makes sense how it's formatted. So in this, what I'm going to show you and what you're going to play with is we're just going to define a couple people, Alice and Bob. You'll recognize those names from the book because that's the example that your book uses. And they're going to bank at banks A and B at first, but we might need to add some more banks later. And then we're going to just set up a function to show how money might move around. So first, we're just going to create a couple banks accounts with people in them. So I think it is worth just really briefly to go over because code is scary looking, but then when we like take a second to look at it, it can be a lot less scary soon. And again, you're not going to have to write code, but it might be worth understanding just a little bit. Because part of the goal of this, I don't want you to be scared of Python or things like Colab. I don't necessarily need you to be like, oh, I'm going to go code a bunch of stuff in Python. No, I just don't want you to be scared of it because I promise, I used to be scared of coding. I used to be super scared of Excel. But then once I used them a little, saw them a little, I became a lot less worried about it. So we said we're going to make people and bank accounts. So right here we have people named Alice and Bob. We're just making a list of two people. And we have banks, and we got a list of two banks. So starting balance is in US dollars. So balance is equals zero point 0 index people, columns bank. So we're just putting zero everywhere right now is what's happening right there. And then we're saying, okay, Alice is going to have $100 at Bank A. Bob is going to have $100 at Bank A. Bob is going to have $100 at Bank B. So now we can look at Bank A and B's spreadsheet right here. So they have two customers in existence in our little banking world, and we have two banks in existence. Bob banks at both places. He has a $100 balance at both banks. Alice has $100 at Bank A, but doesn't have any money at Bank B. And now what you'll see is we're going to go over some of the similar transactions that the book goes over, and we're just going to display what happens, show how we update those things in Python, which again, you won't have to do, but maybe just seeing it hopefully will make it seem a little less daunting. So when both the sender and the receiver use the same bank, a digital payment is simply an internal update to the bank's ledger. So no, again, what we're emphasizing is that nothing physical is moving around here. Literally, code is changing in a ledger, in a book sheet. Just like in this, we're just going to change code. So Alice and Bob both hold accounts at Bank A. Alice pays Bob $10. Only Bank A's internal records will change as a result of that. So we just make these updates. So before we just had the same balances. Now Alice has $90, but Bob has $110. Only things at Bank A are changing. So different bank transfer, interbank settlement is what that's called. So now suppose Alice banks at Bank A, but Bob wants the money in his account at Bank B. This is where digital money stops being a simple internal update because now we have two banks involved, and Bank A and B must coordinate changes to their balance sheets. To keep things simple, we will model a settlement using interbank settlement account between the two banks. If Bank A owes Bank B money, Bank A's settlement balance decreases and Bank B's settlement balance increases. Then Bob's deposit at Bank A increases. This captures the basic idea of interbank settlement without getting into the full institutional details, which I'm not going to give you the full institutional details of interbank settlement because economists tend to hand wave over those things. But this is kind of what that would look like. So, okay, now we have 90 and 110, 0, 1, 100. Before interbank settlement positions, so Bank A, nobody has interbank settlement right now because the transaction that we've discussed hasn't occurred yet. So Alice pays Bob $10 from Bank A to Bank B. So now Bob has 10 more dollars. So notice Alice has 80 less. Bob has 10 more, but now it's over at Bank B. And now the banks and their internal bookkeeping, ignoring Bob and Alice, they have this sort of settlement balance. So bank B is a negative 10. It basically owes bank A $10 from making this update up here because it created $10 that it didn't have at its bank. So now it needs to go get that $10 from bank A. So now the book also mentions these two different types of settlement systems that really are based on technology. And so we have real time versus essentially end of day as DNS. So deferred to the end of day, it could be deferred to any time, but traditionally it was end of business day. And so if it happened on the weekend, that would become a longer business day, basically. And so this is going to go through a variety of transactions. And the point of this, so this just takes more code because you'll see down here, a lot of that code is just getting the side-by-side display. But basically what's going to be happening is with this deferred system, the banks don't catch up to the fact that Bob is out of money as early as they do in real time. So it's a very simple idea. If the banks are checking balances every time a transaction is made, then they're going to notice an overdraft transaction right after it occurs. Maybe it'll go through, but they're going to, then the second one, if that overdrafter tries to make a second transaction, that will be declined. Versus an end of day, somebody might go and say, I have $10 in my bank account, but I'm going to go spend $1 million at 1,000 different retailers today. And my bank isn't going to notice until the end of the day because they use deferred balance. And so this is just showing how that occurs on the real time we catch it earlier. So we don't end up in the situation where we have a big unpaid balance that essentially Bob cannot afford because he doesn't have any money unless he's sitting on money in a different account that we're not modeling here. And now what you really want to do is imagine this at a much larger scale. Bernie Madoff scale. This is kind of like what Bernie Madoff did. If you know that story, if you don't, Google it really quick. You can learn about it pretty quickly. But basically, he was able, nobody was forcing him to settle payments in full in real time. He was always able to, don't worry. I'm just like, I have my piece of paper with everybody's name on it and everybody's money. They'll get their money back. Also, you made 20% last year on paper. I'm not going to actually give you any money, but I'm going to tell you you made a lot of money. And we can imagine that getting out of control. So I just wanted you guys to get in the weeds on this, play with it a little. Um, and then there's some summary down here for when you're looking at it. Now, I also did a cross-border one down here. The main reason I wanted to do that is that we have to introduce an exchange rate. So the exchange rate, notice that the exchange rate plays a role right here. I tried to use a relatively up-to-date exchange rate between pounds, or is that euros? Yeah, euros and dollars. Let me see. Let's make sure we did. I'm losing the, yeah, euros. We're doing euros in this one. So that means that in addition, we have different banks now. We might have correspondent banking or central banking that's helping take care of that foreign exchange that's occurring in the background because now we're exchanging euros for US dollars. So we just have to be a little bit more careful about that. Really, this is just, it's very simple arithmetic, but I do want you to just get in your head. This is how the digital money economy is operating. It is changes in balance sheets. These are extremely simplistic versions of that, of course, but that's how it's happening. And all of these involve trusted intermediaries, trusted bookkeepers in the background. There's people that need to be involved other than the people that are directly involved in the transaction, Bob and Alice. Where we're going next is, okay, how can we have these types of transactions without trusted intermediaries? That's kind of a goal of we want to think about. Is there a way to remove the keeper of the spreadsheet from this process? And that's really the question that Bitcoin says, yes, we can do it. Um, and yeah, that's where we're going next. The next, when we're building the pieces now, because we need to understand what's Today is about understanding what cryptocurrencies are responding to. Cryptocurrencies are responding to the transition from cash to digital money. Can we get some of the characteristics that we had in cash back in this new, brave new world of digital money? That is the motivating question. Next time, we're going to build some pieces from computer science we need and from math, cryptography, and that is going to be a major building block to getting to the answer, yes, we can get some of these characteristics back. All right. So have a good week. Don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions about this collab, quiz, anything else in the class, or anything else related to your economics education. Um, and good to see you. See you later.